I have told this story so many times at my brother's table, to nieces and nephews who beg for it the way other children beg for ghost stories, that I sometimes forget I am the only man living who saw the whole of it from the first hour to the last. My brother remembers his half. She remembers hers. I am the one who stood on the harbor steps at Kelmouth and watched a debtor's daughter sold like a length of rope, and watched my brother, a man the county called the Devil Duke, a man I had seen face down a charging bull without blinking, go the color of old ash. His name was Alaric Vane, 9th Duke of Blackmere, and he was my elder brother by 6 years, though by the time this happened I had long since stopped thinking of the gap between us. We had buried our parents together. We had rebuilt Blackmere's roof together, plank by plank, when the estate's coffers ran thinner than either of us admitted aloud. The county called him the devil for the cold set of his face at assizes, for the way he had once ridden through a mob of rioting tenants and dared them to touch him, for the rumor, half true, that he had put a man out on the road in the dead of winter for cheating a widow of her cottage. What the county never said, because the county never saw it, was that my brother kept a code sharper than any law book, and that he had never once broken it. We had come to Kelmouth, a gray harbor town stitched along a crescent of cliffs on the Northumbrian coast, because a shipment of Blackmere timber had gone astray in the customs house there, and Alaric trusted no one's ledger but his own eyes. We arrived on a Thursday. We meant to leave by Saturday. Instead, we stood on the harbor steps on Friday morning and watched a crowd gather the way crowds gather for a hanging, and I asked a fishwife beside me what manner of spectacle drew such a mob to the quay before the tide had even properly turned. "Debt sail," she said, not unkindly, chewing on the words like a woman chewing on gristle. "Old Fenwick's lost the lot, the chandlery, the house, near everything he owns to Bardolph the moneylender. Word is Bardolph's called the whole debt due, and Fenwick's put his own daughter up to settle it, contracted her out. There's men come from 3 parishes over to bid on the marrying of her." I had heard of such things, a shameful old custom clinging on in a few backward harbor towns, dressed up as a betrothal auction so that no one could call it what it plainly was. A woman sold to cover her father's failures, with the church's blessing laundering the transaction into something that could be spoken of at supper. I had never seen one. I did not want to see one now. But my brother had gone very still beside me, the way he went still before he did something no one expected, and I knew there was no drawing him away. "Alaric," I said, "this is not our business." He did not answer me. He was looking at the girl. She stood on a raised platform of unpainted planks that someone had knocked together against the harbor wall, and she stood the way a woman stands when she has decided that the one thing left in her possession is the straightness of her own spine. She wore a gray wool dress gone thin at the elbows, mended twice at the hem with thread that did not quite match, and her hair was pulled back plainly beneath a bonnet that had been turned and retrimmed until the ribbon had lost its color. She was, I judged, perhaps 22. She did not weep. She did not beg the crowd's pity, though I saw pity flicker across more than one face in that press of fishermen and merchants and idle boys come to gawk. She looked out over the water instead, as though the sea were the only witness she cared to have. "Marguerite Fenwick," called the auctioneer, a barrel-bodied man with a ledger under his arm and a moneylender's watchful eyes. This, I would learn within the hour, was Josiah Bardolph himself, come to collect his due in person rather than trust the business to an agent. Sound of body, of good character, schooled in her letters and in keeping accounts. Her father's debt stands at £400. The gentleman who settles that debt and signs the contract of betrothal takes her hand within the fortnight. "It is barbaric," I said low to my brother. "It is legal," he said, which was not the same thing, and I heard in his voice the particular flatness he used when he was memorizing a wrong so that he might later correct it. A man near the front, thick through the shoulders, red in the face, called out a figure. £410. I recognized him after a moment as Silas Grieve, who owned the largest fishing fleet in the harbor and a reputation for working his wives, of whom he had buried 2 already, harder than he worked his nets. The girl on the platform did not so much as glance at him, though something in her shoulders drew in, a fraction, the way a person draws in against a wind they have long since learned they cannot escape. 420, said another voice, and a third bidder entered. I have turned this next moment over more times than I can count, trying to find the exact instant my brother decided. I believe now that he had decided before we ever climbed those harbor steps, that the moment the fishwife said asterisk contracted her out, some old, buried thing in him had already resolved itself, and all that remained was watching the numbers climb high enough to give his hand its excuse. 500 pounds, said the Duke of Blackmere, in a voice that did not need to be raised to silence a harbor. The crowd turned as one. I felt every eye that had been fixed on the girl swing instead to my brother, and I felt, absurdly, a flush of pride even as my stomach dropped through the planks beneath my boots, because whatever this was, it was no longer a private folly. It was about to become the talk of 3 counties. Bardolph's watchful eyes sharpened at the sound of a sum that dwarfed the debt he was owed. Greaves' red face went redder, and the girl, Marguerite Fenwick, whose name I had only just learned, looked, for the first time since I had set eyes on her, directly at the man who had spoken. I could not read what passed over her face. Not fear, though fear would have been forgivable. Not hope, not yet hope is a slower thing than that, and she had likely learned not to spend it cheaply. What I saw, I think, was calculation. A woman doing arithmetic on her own life, weighing one stranger's coin against another's and finding neither some, yet a thing to trust. 600, said Grieve, thick-voiced, and there was a note of spite in it now, a man who does not like to be outbid in front of his neighbors. My brother did not blink. 1,000 pounds, he said, and I will have the contract of debt itself, Mr. Bardolph, made over to me entire this hour, with the girl's father discharged of it in full and in writing before a magistrate. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a crowd, recalculating what kind of story it has wandered into. Bardolph licked his lips. 1,000 pounds was more coin than his whole money-lending trade in Kelmouth turned in 3 years, and I watched the arithmetic of greed war briefly, with something that might almost have been caution. Your Grace has not yet given his name, he said. Alaric Vane, said my brother, Duke of Blackmere, and I will have my man of business draw the papers within the hour, or you may explain to whichever magistrate rides this circuit why you refused a legal settlement of a legal debt. There is a particular way a room full of frightened, greedy men decides, all at once, to become agreeable, and I watched it happen on that harbor quay. Greaves subsided, muttering, already turning to find some other misfortune to profit from. Bardolph produced his ledger with the speed of a man who has just remembered he is, at bottom, a merchant, and merchants do not turn down 1,000 pounds to satisfy their pride. And Marguerite Fenwick stood on her platform of unpainted planks with her hands folded in front of her thin gray skirt, watching my brother with an expression I would spend the better part of the next month trying to name. It was only later, walking back up from the quay with the papers half drawn and the whole harbor already buzzing with the tale, that I asked him the question I had been holding since the word 1,000 left his mouth. Why? Alaric did not look at me. He was watching a gull wheel over the masts of the fishing boats, or pretending to. Because no one else was going to, he said. That is not an answer. It is the only one I have, he said, and something in his voice told me not to press further, though I noted that I had never in 26 years heard my brother spend money he had not first weighed to the last farthing, nor seen him spend it so fast, or so completely without calculation, as he had just done for a debtor's daughter he had known for the length of an auction. We took rooms that night at the Harbor Bell, the best the town could offer, which was not very good, and my brother sent word that Miss Fenwick and her father should be given a private parlor, and a proper supper at his expense, separate from the common room where half of Kelmouth had gathered to trade the day's gossip. I went down to see the arrangements made, and it was there, in the low-beamed corridor outside that parlor, that I first spoke to her alone. She was standing at the small window at the corridor's end, looking out at the last gray light over the water, and she did not hear me approach until I was nearly beside her. "Miss Fenwick," I said, "I am Julian Vane, the Duke's brother." She turned, and up close I saw what the distance of the harbor steps had hidden: deep, steady brown eyes, a fine intelligence the auctioneer's talk had not begun to capture, and a loveliness that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with the dignity she wore like armor. "Then I owe your family a debt I cannot see how to repay," she said, "and I confess it sits uneasily with me, sir, to be so beholden to strangers." "You owe my brother nothing," I said. "He would tell you the same, though he is not a man who explains himself easily." "No," she agreed. "I gathered that much from watching him buy a woman he had never met for twice what she was worth on the open market." There was a dryness in her voice that surprised me, not bitterness, though she had every right to bitterness, but something closer to a rueful, private humor, the humor of a woman who has learned to survive her circumstances by refusing to be entirely crushed by them. "Forgive me. That was uncharitable. I am grateful. I only find gratitude and confusion arrive together, and I have not yet sorted which is louder." "He is not a man who does things by half," I said, which was true, and safer than the other things I might have said. "So I am learning," she said, and looked back out the window, and I left her to her thoughts, because I sensed, correctly, as it turned out, that she needed the length of that gray evening to decide what kind of woman she meant to be inside a life that had just been upended twice in a single day. Her father, when I met him briefly at supper, was a weak, apologetic man, quick to explain the failures of the shipping trade and slower to look his daughter in the eye. I did not like him. Marguerite served him his soup and spoke to him gently regardless, because, whatever his failures, he was still her father, and she had been raised, I came to understand, by a mother now dead, to believe that a woman's dignity was a thing she carried inside herself, not a thing others could strip from her. Later that same night, unable to sleep for the strangeness of the day, I went down to the Harbor Bell's kitchen in search of tea and found Marguerite already there, sitting alone by the banked fire with her hands wrapped around a cup she was not drinking from. She did not startle at my arrival, which told me something of the composure she had built over years of practice. "I keep waiting to wake from it," she said, without my asking. "I have imagined 100 ways this week might end, sir, and not one of them looked like this." "What did you imagine instead?" I asked, taking the bench across from her. "Grieve," she said simply, "or a man like him. I had made my peace with it before we ever climbed onto that platform, because I judged it wiser to grieve the loss of my own choosing in private than to let the harbor watch me do it. I did not imagine a duke would raise his hand at all, let alone that he would look, when he did it, as though the money mattered to him less than the wrong he was correcting." "He is not a performing man," I said. "Whatever he does because he has already decided it is right, not because anyone is watching." "Then I am fortunate twice over," she said, "for it seems he decided rightly, and I was watching after all." She smiled then, the first true smile I had seen from her, small and startled at itself, as though she had not expected to find anything to smile about so soon, and I carried that small, private smile back up to my room and thought before I slept that whatever my brother had begun on that harbor quay, it was not going to end as simply as a debt discharged and a contract signed. My brother did not join us at that supper. He took his meal alone in his room, which I thought odd until I understood, over the following days, that he was afraid of himself, afraid of what he had just done, afraid of what it meant that he had done it, and unwilling to sit across a table from the consequence of his own impulse until he had made some private peace with it. The papers were signed the following morning. Bardolph's debt was discharged. Old Fenwick, freed of the weight that had been crushing him, wept with a relief that struck me as more selfish than paternal, and thanked my brother in a stream of words that Alaric endured rather than welcomed. And Marguerite Fenwick, no longer a debtor's daughter but a woman under contract of betrothal to the Duke of Blackmere himself, a fact the whole of Kelmouth was already reshaping into legend before the ink had dried, was handed, along with her one small trunk, into our carriage for the 3 days' journey south to Blackmere. I rode inside with her for the better part of the first day, since my brother chose, as was his habit when troubled, to ride alongside on horseback rather than sit still with his own thoughts in a closed carriage. She watched the coastline give way to moor, and the moor give way to the first soft hills of Blackmere's country, with the careful attention of a woman memorizing an escape route, and I understood that she did not yet trust that this new arrangement would hold, that some part of her was braced for the whole thing to be revealed as another transaction dressed in kinder words. "You need not fear him," I said, somewhere past the second milestone. "I do not fear the Duke," she said. "I fear becoming a woman who has been bought twice, once by a moneylender's debt, and now by a stranger's whim, and calling the second one love because it is kinder than admitting the truth of it." I had no ready answer for that because it was, I thought, the most honest thing anyone had said to me in a fortnight, and I spent the rest of that day's journey turning it over. On the second day, when the road grew rough enough that even my brother abandoned his horse for the carriage, I watched the two of them attempt conversation for the first time since Kelmouth, and understood at once why he had preferred to ride alone. He asked her stiffly whether the carriage suited her comfort. She answered with equal stiffness that it did. It was Marguerite in the end who broke the pattern. "You need not treat me as though I might shatter your grace," she said. "I have survived a father's ruin and a public auction. I am not so delicate as this silence suggests you believe me to be." My brother looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face eased. "Forgive me. I have negotiated treaties with furious tenant farmers and argued law before magistrates, but I confess a betrothed stranger in my own carriage test skills I did not know I lacked." She almost smiled at that, and the rest of the journey passed easier for it. The silences no longer strained but merely quiet, the kind two people share when they have stopped performing for each other. Blackmere itself, when we reached it on the third evening, rose gray and vast against a sky gone the color of a bruise, its towers older than any title my family had ever held, its grounds run a little wild in places where money had been needed elsewhere for years. The last mile of the drive ran between 2 rows of ancient oaks planted, our father used to say, by some long-dead vane who had wanted travelers to feel small before they ever reached the house, and I watched Marguerite study those oaks with the same careful attention she had given the coastline, not with the awe I half expected from a chandler's daughter seeing a duke's seat for the first time, but with the quiet, assessing look of a woman deciding whether a place could ever be made to feel like her own, whatever grandeur it wore on the outside. Marguerite stepped down from the carriage and stood looking up at it the way she had stood on the auction platform, spine straight, chin level, giving nothing away, and my brother, dismounting beside her, said the first words I had heard him speak to her directly since the harbor. "It is not a comfortable house," he said. "I will not pretend otherwise, but no one under this roof will ever again put a price upon you. That much I can promise, whatever else I cannot." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is a strange promise to make a woman you bought at auction, Your Grace." "I did not buy you," he said, and something in his voice cracked, just slightly, the first crack I had seen in 26 years of watching him hold himself together through every grief our family had handed him. "I paid a debt that should never have existed, so that no other man could buy you instead. There is a difference, though I grant you the world outside this gate will be slow to see it." She did not answer that, but she did not look away from him either, and I marked that as the true beginning, though neither of them would have named it so at the time. That first night at Blackmere, My brother gave orders that surprised even Mrs. Averill, who had run his household since before I could walk. Marguerite was to have the finest guest chambers in the house, a maid of her own choosing, and want for nothing that coin could supply. "She is not a guest," he told Mrs. Averill within my hearing, "and she is not an obligation. She is to be treated as the future mistress of this house from this hour forward." Mrs. Averill only nodded and said she would see to it, though I caught the flicker of curiosity in her eyes. The same curiosity, I imagine, that sat behind every face in that household as they watched their brooding, unreadable Duke go quietly out of his depth over a woman he had met on a harbor quay. The weeks that followed were, on their surface, ordinary enough, the ordinary business of a household absorbing a stranger, of a betrothal that the county gossiped over with a hunger that made my brother grimmer at every dinner he was forced to attend. But beneath that surface, I watched something else take shape, slowly, the way frost takes shape on a window overnight, invisible until suddenly the whole pane is covered in it. Marguerite did not wait to be given a place in that house. Within a fortnight she had found the housekeeper, Mrs. Averill, sorting through ledgers grown tangled after a run of poor harvests, and had quietly set herself to helping untangle them, her father's ruin having taught her more of figures and accounts than most gentlewomen ever learned. She found the estate's small tenant school, half abandoned for want of a teacher willing to live so far from any town, and began, 2 afternoons a week, to teach the fishermen's and farmers' children their letters, walking down the long drive in her plain gray dress rather than wait for a carriage. She considered an extravagance for so short a distance. She was, in short, exactly the kind of woman the county would have called unremarkable, had the county not already decided, on the strength of the harbor auction alone, that she must be either a fortune hunter or a fool. My brother watched all of this the way a man watches whether he does not yet trust to hold fair. I do not think he believed at first that her steadiness was real. He had seen too much falseness dressed as virtue in the drawing rooms of London to trust it easily in his own home, and had said to me once, before the harbor, that he expected to die unmarried rather than spend his life guessing which of a woman's smiles were true. But I watched him watching her, evening after evening, across the long dining table where conversation was often thin and careful between them, and I watched the particular quality of his silence change, week by week, from suspicion into something far more dangerous to a man who had built his whole life on never being surprised. It was a wet evening in the 6th week, I remember, when I first saw him nearly lose the battle he was fighting with himself. We had gathered in the smaller drawing room, the fire built high against a storm coming in off the moor, and Marguerite was reading aloud from a volume of old ballads she had found in the estate's neglected library. Reading, I should say, in a voice that had a low, unhurried music to it, the voice of a woman who had once read to a sick mother through long nights, and had never entirely lost the habit of reading as though someone's comfort depended upon it. She came to a verse about a woman waiting at a harbor for a ship that would not come, and her voice caught, just slightly, on the word waiting, and I saw my brother's hand tighten on the arm of his chair until the knuckles went pale. "You need not read on if it grieves you," he said. "It does not grieve me," she said, though I thought it likely did, a little, given where her own harbor waiting had led her. "It only reminds me that not every waiting ends in wreck." She looked up from the page and found him already looking at her, and for a moment neither of them looked away, and I understood, watching them, that I was witnessing something neither of them yet had words for, and that my presence in the room had become, suddenly, an intrusion I ought to end. I made some excuse about the state of my boots and left them to the fire and the storm, and when I returned an hour later, they were sitting much as I had left them, at a careful distance, speaking of nothing more dangerous than the weather. But there was a warmth in the room that had not been there before, the particular warmth of two people who have stood at the edge of something and stepped back from it only because neither yet trusted it was theirs to take. There were other evenings like it in the weeks that followed, small and unremarkable to anyone who did not know what to look for. I remember one in particular, a market day, when Marguerite returned from the tenant's school later than usual, her bonnet damp from a sudden shower, and found my brother himself waiting at the door with a dry shawl he had fetched from the hall closet rather than send a servant to do it. He did not make a show of it. He simply held it out, and she took it, and something passed between them in that small exchange that neither commented upon, though I noticed, from where I stood pretending to study the estate accounts in the next room, that his hand lingered a moment longer than strict courtesy required, and that she did not step back from it. I remember, too, an afternoon when one of the tenant children was carried up to the house crying after a fall from the orchard wall, and it was Marguerite who set the small wrist with a steadiness that surprised even Mrs. Averill, having nursed her own mother through a long illness with no doctor near enough to call. My brother stood in the doorway through the whole of it, saying nothing, but I understood that he was watching a woman make herself indispensable not through any calculated bid for his favor, but simply because it was in her nature to be useful, and that this, more than any beauty or dowry, was the thing slowly undoing him. It was not all so gentle as that evening, however, and I would be doing this story a disservice if I let it seem that the road from the harbor to the altar ran smooth. Word reached us in the 8th week that Silas Grieve, the fisherman my brother had outbid at auction, and a man who had nursed his humiliation in that time rather than let it die a natural death, had begun spreading a story through the harbor towns, and worse, through certain drawing rooms in the county, that the Duke of Blackmere had not rescued a debtor's daughter at all, but had simply found a cheaper and more fashionable way to purchase the same thing Grieve himself had tried honestly to buy. A wife with no family left to object to however she was used. It was a cruel story precisely because it borrowed just enough truth to wound. My brother had, after all, paid coin for her. The contract, however kindly meant, was still a contract, and there were women in the county, I will not pretend otherwise, who received Marguerite at the few functions she was obliged to attend with a chill politeness that made plain they had heard Grieve's version and found it more entertaining than the truth. The worst of it came at a dinner given by Lady Esther Calworth, who had invited half the county, I came to believe, expressly to see how the Duke's harbor bride would bear up under polite cruelty. Marguerite bore it, at first, with the same straight spine she had carried on the auction platform. But when Lady Calworth asked brightly whether Marguerite meant to have her wedding gown made in Kelmouth, where I am told such transactions are conducted so efficiently, a ripple of laughter went round the table, small and cruel, the kind that does more damage than any shout. I saw Marguerite's hand go still on her wine glass. I saw the color leave her face and then return, fiercer, as though she had reached for her mother's old lesson and found it exactly where she had left it. "I understand my history amuses you, Lady Calworth," she said, in a voice that did not shake. "I will not pretend it does not shame me a little to have been the subject of an auction. But shame belongs properly to those who arrange such things, not to those who survive them, and I notice you have not yet told me whether you found the fish course to your taste, which suggests you would rather discuss my history than your dinner. I am happy to oblige you further, though I warn you I have grown rather good at bearing scrutiny, and I do not tire of it quickly." The table went silent the way tables go silent when someone has said the thing everyone was thinking. And then, astonishingly, one of the younger guests laughed outright and said she thought Miss Fenwick the most refreshing guest the county had produced in a decade, and the moment, somehow, turned. My brother had said nothing throughout the exchange. But when I glanced at him, I saw that he had gone entirely still, the same stillness I had seen on the harbor steps, and I understood that he was watching the woman he had rescued prove, in front of the very people most inclined to despise her, that she had never needed rescuing at all in the way the county assumed, that she had needed only the chance to stand somewhere she could not be sold, and she would do the rest herself. She was not the only guest whose opinion shifted that night. Small invitations began arriving at Blackmere in the days that followed, and Marguerite accepted each with the same quiet grace. I began to understand that the county's opinion of her was not fixed at all, but a tide, and that she had simply refused to drown in it long enough for it to turn. He did not speak to her of it that night, but the following morning I found him in the estate's small chapel, of all places, a room he rarely entered except for Sunday obligation, sitting alone in the front pew with his head bowed, and when I asked him, gently, what troubled him, he said something I have never forgotten. "I bought her out of a debt," he said, "and I have spent 2 months telling myself that was an act of honor, because I could not bear to call it what it has become. I do not merely wish to keep my promise to her, Julian. I wish to spend the rest of my life earning the right to stand beside a woman who does not need me at all, and would rather have me anyway." "Then tell her so," I said. "And if she refuses me," he said, and I heard, for the first time in his life, real fear in my brother's voice, not the fear of scandal or ruin that had never once troubled him, but the plain fear of a man who has finally found something he cannot simply purchase or command into being. "She agreed to a contract, Julian. She has never once said she wanted the man attached to it." I did not have an answer for him that morning, but I did not think, watching Marguerite these past weeks, that his fear was well-founded, and I told him so, though he did not entirely believe me until events forced the question before either of them was quite ready for it. The trouble, when it came from an unexpected quarter. Old Fenwick, restored to solvency and installed by my brother's charity in a modest house near Kelmouth, had not learned the lesson his ruin ought to have taught him. Within 3 months he had borrowed again, smaller sums this time, but from a harder man than Bardolph, with a reputation for collecting debts by whatever means proved cheapest. When that debt came due and Fenwick could not pay it, the moneylender's agents did not trouble themselves with a magistrate. They came instead to Blackmere itself, on a raw spring morning, demanding that Fenwick's daughter make good her father's new debt, or else they would tell every newspaper in the north that the Duke's celebrated harbor rescue had been nothing more than the purchase of a woman whose family's debts came entailed upon her indefinitely. I was in the hall when the agents made their demand, my first instinct fury at Fenwick himself, whose weakness had once again placed his daughter in harm's path. But it was Marguerite who came down the great staircase before my brother could be fetched, and Marguerite who faced the 2 agents with a composure that put my own scattered anger to shame. "You will not have a farthing from this house," she said, "and you may print whatever you please in whatever newspaper you please, for I have done nothing in my life to be ashamed of, and I find I no longer care what strangers believe of me. My father's debts are his own to answer for. I settled the last one with my freedom, gentlemen, and I do not intend to settle another with anything at all." It was, I thought, a magnificent thing to watch. A woman who had once stood mute upon an auction platform now refusing flatly to be sold a second time by anyone, including her own blood. But the agents were hard men, and the bolder of the 2 took a step toward her with a paper thrust out, saying something about how a woman under a duke's protection had no business speaking of freedom as though it were hers to claim. He did not finish the sentence. My brother had come into the hall behind Marguerite without either of us hearing him, and the sound of his voice, low and utterly without warmth, stopped the agent where he stood. "You will step back from her," Alaric said, "and you will do it now, or your next conversation will be with a magistrate of my choosing, about the practice of threatening gentlewomen in their own homes. I settled a debt at Kelmouth Harbor in full view of half that town, and I will settle this one the same way, but I will not have this woman spoken to as though she is a ledger entry to be collected against. Is that understood?" The agents understood it well enough. They left within the hour, their master's demand quietly bought off by my brother's man of business, and Fenwick himself was made to understand, in terms considerably less gentle than any my brother had used on his daughter's behalf, that there would be no third rescue if he could not learn to live within whatever modest means remained to him. But it was not the settling of the debt that mattered in the end. It was what happened after, when the hall had emptied and Marguerite stood alone with the two of us, her composure finally cracking now that the danger had passed, her hands trembling faintly at her sides, though her voice, when she spoke, was steady still. "I am sorry," she said. "I have brought this house nothing but debts and scandal since the day you found me on that platform, and I would not blame you, Your Grace, if you had let them take their due today and washed your hands of the whole Fenwick name." "Do you truly believe that of me?" my brother said, "after everything?" "I do not know what I believe, only what I fear," she said, the words coming faster now, as though a door long braced shut had finally given way. And here at last the steadiness broke, and I saw tears she had held back finally rise in her eyes. "I fear that every kindness you have shown me has been the same coin as the £1,000 you spent at that auction, generous and real, and entirely separate from wanting me. I have spent 3 months telling myself I would bear that with dignity, because dignity is the one thing no one has ever managed to auction away from me. But I find I have stopped wanting dignity and started wanting you asterisk, and I do not know what to do with that, because I was never meant to want anything from this arrangement beyond my own survival." It was the first time I had heard her use his given name, and I saw it land on him like a physical thing. "Marguerite," he said, and crossed the hall to her in 3 strides, and took her hands in his the way a man takes hold of something he has been afraid, for months, that he had no right to touch. "I did not ride to that harbor looking for a bargain. I did not know, when I raised my hand and named a sum, that I was doing anything more than correcting a wrong I could not stomach watching. But I have spent every day since learning that the wrong I corrected was the least of what I found there. I do not want a wife who was bought, Marguerite. I want a wife who chooses to stay, knowing she has never needed me and stays anyway, because some part of her wants to. And if I told you," she said, her voice barely above the sound of the fire in the hearth, "that I have wanted to stay since the first evening at the Harbor Bell, when your brother told me you were not a man who explained himself easily, and I found myself hoping, God forgive me, that I might someday be the one person you troubled yourself to explain things to. Then I would tell you," my brother said, "that you have had that privilege since the moment I named £1,000 on a harbor quay, and discovered I meant every word of the promise I made you outside this very house, that no one would ever again put a price upon you. I did not know, when I said it, that the truest price I would end up paying was my own heart, given entirely and without hope of return. I am asking you now freely, with no debt and no contract standing between us, whether you will have me, not the Duke who bought your father's note, but the man who has spent 3 months falling in love with the woman who paid it back to him tenfold in nothing but her own steadiness." She laughed then, through her tears, a small startled sound. "You have thought a great deal about ledgers and debts for a man who claims this is not a transaction." "Old habits," he admitted, the corner of his mouth lifting into something almost sheepish. "I find I cannot stop weighing sums even now, when the only one that matters is how completely I have come to love you, and there is no ledger in England large enough to record it properly." I have never, before or since, seen my brother's face so unguarded as it was in that moment, waiting on her answer, and I have never seen a woman's face transformed so completely as Marguerite's did, the wariness of 3 months' careful survival finally giving way to something unguarded in return. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Alaric, I will have you not for the debt and not for the house, and not for anything you have ever given me, but for the man who stood on a wet harbor quay and could not bear to watch an injustice pass him by. I have wanted to say yes since the moment you spoke my name to that crowd as though it were something precious rather than a line in a ledger. I only needed you to ask me freely, so that I might answer freely too." He kissed her then, gently in the fading light of that hall, with the tears still bright on her face, and the debt papers from that morning still lying forgotten on the table where the agents had left them. A private moment that I, feeling every inch the intruder I had felt in the drawing room those weeks before, withdrew from as quietly as I could manage. Though I confess I stood outside the hall door for a moment longer than strict propriety allowed, smiling like a fool at nothing at all. The wedding, when it came 6 weeks later, was nothing like the grim transaction that had begun their story. It was held in the estate's own small chapel, and half of Kelmouth made the long journey south to see it, fishermen and their wives, the harbor's washerwomen, even, I am told, Josiah Bardolph, come to witness what his ledger had unknowingly set in motion. Silas Grieve did not attend, and no one missed him. Marguerite wore no grand gown of silk and lace, though my brother would gladly have bought her 100 such gowns. She wore instead a simple dress of pale blue, made by her own hand with Mrs. Averil's help, because she wished to be married as herself. Watching her walk the short aisle toward my brother, I thought I had never seen a woman look more like exactly what she was, a survivor, a teacher, a keeper of ledgers, now walking toward a man who had recognized, before anyone else in that harbor crowd, precisely what she was worth. My brother wept quietly when she reached him, the Devil Duke, who had ridden through a rioting mob without blinking, undone entirely by the sight of a debtor's daughter in a plain blue dress. I stood as his groomsman with tears of my own that I made no effort to hide, because I had watched the whole of it from that first morning on the harbor steps, and I knew, better than any other soul alive, exactly how far the two of them had traveled to reach that small chapel and that quiet vow. They have been married now for many years, and Blackmere has never once in all that time felt like the cold gray fortress it seemed on the evening she first arrived, her chin lifted against whatever the house might ask of her. She still teaches at the tenant school, though she no longer walks there in a mendied gray dress. She still keeps half the estate's ledgers herself, and keeps them better, I am told by everyone who has occasion to know, than any steward my family ever employed. My brother still carries the name the county gave him, the Devil Duke, and wears it now the way a man wears an old joke at his own expense, because he knows, and I know, and above all Marguerite knows, that whatever devil the county once saw in him burned away entirely on a wet harbor morning when he could not bear to watch a good woman sold for want of £400. Lady Calworth, I should add, eventually became one of Marguerite's most devoted correspondents, having discovered that she preferred the company of a woman who had outmatched her at her own table to the company of women who merely flattered her. Old Fenwick lived out his remaining years near Kelmouth, chastened at last, and if he never became the father Marguerite deserved, he did stop being the father who cost her so dearly. Josiah Bardolph, I am told, kept a framed copy of the discharged debt papers on his counting-house wall until the day he died, calling it the finest bargain he had ever struck, though he had not understood at the time that he was striking it at all. I asked her once, years afterward, sitting by the nursery fire with one of their children asleep against her shoulder, whether she had ever truly believed in those first frightened weeks that the man who bought her father's debt might come to love her rather than merely keep her. No, she said, smiling the way she still smiles when she thinks of that harbor, I did not believe it at all. I only hoped for it, the way a woman waiting at a harbor hopes for a ship she has been told will never come. But I have learned, Julian, that hope kept honestly without bitterness has a way of bringing the ship in after all, and I have never, not for one single day since, regretted keeping mine. That, I think, is the whole of the story, though I have told it 100 times and will likely tell it 100 more before I am done. Not merely that a duke rescued a debtor's daughter from an auction block, though he did, and gladly, and would do it again without a moment's hesitation, but that a woman who had every reason to trust nothing and no one chose, in the end, to trust anyway, and found, waiting on the other side of that trust, a man who had been quietly, hopelessly in love with her steadiness since the very first hour he saw her standing on a harbor platform, refusing to let the world convince her she was worth nothing more than the debt written against her name.